I think, I wouldn't say, oh, you should go have a big ayahuasca journey because of perimenopause necessarily, maybe for some people, but I would more say, could something gently support you and help you see what needs to change in your life? What might be your next step, your next phase, this next version of you? I absolutely think that master plants can have a role there.
Hello again.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Maya?
I am doing okay in this crazy world we're living in right now.
Yes. Seems to get a little bit more bananas. Like there's always like a new war. I know we're kind of getting into the show. I usually like stop this pre-chat. I'm like, let's start with the show, but let's just keep going with this because I feel like, and you can redirect me because I feel like so often it's so easy to be like, this is what's wrong. It's climate change. It's the climate. If I just do everything, if I just glue my hands to a precious piece of art from 400 years ago, that's going to help the carbon dioxide problem or whatever So I feel like, yes, we want to be thinking about the human toil on the earth. I think that there are other things. I think we can also, I think just focusing on carbon dioxide is a little bit monolithic and misguided. But, I also think that you can also be the change. You can also start with rebalancing your own nervous system, understanding your light and your darkness, and becoming whole through maybe it's plants, and we can talk about all the different ways that plants can facilitate that. But that's where I feel the change starts. But most people don't want to do that. They want to say, what the problem is? I'm going to just sit down on a highway and I'm going to solve some other problem rather than looking at my own stuff.
Well, so I would there's a lot, I think, to unpack there. And I think just fundamentally, I 100% agree. There's no way that we are really going to ever affect real change of the kind that we want.
Yes.
That we actually want if we don't change ourselves, because we won't be available to receive it and uphold it if we're still stuck in old ways of thinking and old programming. So that's a fundamental, whether we want it or not, whether we like it or not, we absolutely have to engage with our own change, our own agency, our own deprogramming, our own healing, which is not an endpoint, but an ongoing process of life every day. And I think, activism is really interesting. I was an activist, especially in high school. I was talking about the environmental movement and started the first environmental action group in my very huge high school and was on the city council, a student member. I was doing that. People did not think it was cool or interesting at that time. And I was a big activist. And I realized that a lot of times these movements, which can feel very virtuous, right? We know we want this good thing and we see where there's damage. We see where there's problems. We're on the side of truth. We're right. Number one, they are a way of feeling virtuous a lot of the time and not really actually addressing real problems. Number one. They're a way that a lot of people channel rage, which we can discuss if that's really the best way.
I think we should discuss that. Yeah, I'm making a note.
Well, I think, and I'll say the third thing, which is they get hijacked. They get hijacked movements, and you could name almost any movement, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matters, and many, 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 many others do get hijacked by whether from the inside, right, where actually people, organizations, et cetera, in power will send in disruptors, right? Like I remember during Occupy, there were certain demonstrations that got violent, and the people who were in Occupy were saying, we didn't even know those people. Like they would just show up and start rabble rousing, and ended up moving us farther into authoritarian rules, right?
Right.
Getting people arrested, but also making rules about demonstrating and kind of violating civil rights and things like that more and more. And that's what I actually was just writing about in my Instagram story today, was how we think we're doing the right thing and we think we're on the side of right. And a lot of times what's happening is something behind the scenes that introduces chaos in some way that then leads us more into an authoritarian or fascist kind of, I mean, fascist is the extreme end of authoritarianism, right? But, you know, we actually end up losing the rights. We think we're fighting for rights, but we end up being hijacked, you know? And so I think there's a lot of danger. I'm not saying we can't protest. I'm not saying we can't demonstrate for things that we care about. But we have to be so careful in our anger not to get into this righteous rage necessarily, because of how easily we can be manipulated when we're in those high emotions. And that is, I think, it's like it makes us ripe for being propagandized, for being controlled in ways we have no idea we're being controlled. Like, I fight myself sometimes. I want to read the news. I want to see what's going on, particularly if there are things happening in the world that feel very personal to me. And it is usually I'm pretty good at it by now I scan headlines and I'm like, okay, that's all I'm allowed to do right now. I can go back and look deeply into different articles at some point, but like, sometimes I get hijacked too, even though I know as I'm getting hijacked, I'm like, hi, I'm getting hijacked right now. I'm letting myself be hijacked. I'm getting into reading the media and getting into, all of those high emotions. And that makes me vulnerable to all kinds of loss of my own agency, right? And then it detracts from doing the actual work that I need to do on myself, which is really the only way anything changes.
There's so many places I want to go here. I will add, you were saying, the 1, 2, and 3. I think the other thing that happens when you're in these activist groups, it also makes you intolerant. So you are intolerant to, we'll say, dissent, or if your hypothesis is challenged in any way, you completely dismiss it. Maybe there's character assassination, or it's like, those people do things like that and we do things like this, which, gosh, there's so many examples of that in recent history. Certainly the pandemic is something that I think we can all relate to. So we all collectively went through it. It's like, those are the people that wear the masks, and these are the people that don't wear the masks, and those are the people that line up for the vaccine, and these are the people that don't line up for the vaccine. And it's like, those people do things like that, and these people do things like this. And there was just this, on both sides, really just character assassination. So,
well, let me say, because I think what's fundamental that you're talking about, and how you know that you are being sucked into propaganda, is propaganda dehumanizes other.
Yeah.
And so exactly what you're talking about, right? It's like, oh, those Republicans or those Democrats, right? If you're in the US, or vaccinated and non-vaccinated, or, what side of the war do you support, or whatever it is.
Yeah,
and the other people are monsters and should die, right? I mean, and it can be so vitriolic. And there's a lot of reasons for that in the society we're in right now, because we're so connected and yet disconnected, right? Like being online, not really having to like live and navigate ourselves with people that we know, right? And care about, so there's like this lack of community, and we're finding therefore community through dehumanizing other. But that is how you have been hijacked by propaganda, is, and one of the fundamentals in my book that I talk about, and I really think this is a huge part of what master plants are actually here to guide us through, among other things, right, is going from us versus them to me and we. And this us versus, there is never an us versus them. And we know that only more and more and more and more. Science is showing this, systems biology is showing this, Politics are showing this. We know this literally in our bodies, right? Where we thought, oh, the brain's there and the immune system's there and, the gut's over there and the mitochondria are, no, everything is connected to everything. Everything influences everything. Same with the world around us as the world within us. Everyone is connected to everyone else. Everything around us is connected to everything else. And the more quickly that we embrace the idea that what's happening to one person is happening to all people, the sooner we will start. And we are going to be infants when we do start to craft and imagine something different than the ridiculous thing that we are living in right now.
Okay, so let's pull this into plants. How do we, so you mentioned rage before, and activism maybe being a proxy for or an outlet for something like rage. And this isn't a topic I've talked about a ton, although I am very interested in it because I do see it in myself from time to time. And this is more of a female-centric question, but we can also broaden it out. So there's a lot of women that I've talked to, and even just in my own lived experience, there are things that I am angry about, and not just angry about, I am ragefully angry about, and not necessarily in the external world. It can be something that happened in my past, or how I mistreated someone, or how I feel about myself, how I feel I treated someone. So what do we do with that energy? Because that is such a powerful magnetic charge that can, and in many ways it's part of the reason why I feel like I reached a certain level of success was because I was fueled by anger. I was fueled by, I'm going to show so-and-so, I'm going to show this person. But at some point it's like, I just got to put down this backpack because it's so damn heavy and I don't want to carry this anymore. So how do we, what's the word I'm looking for? How would we metabolize? How do we begin to process or channel or use, I think metabolize is the better word. How do we metabolize our rage? And how can plants potentially be a way that we can invite in healing?
I mean, I think that's a very big question, a really important question. And it's funny because it just came up yesterday in a conversation that I was having, because I do think women hold a lot of rage because we don't have a lot of outlets. It's not really permitted to express those kinds of energies, so it comes out in a lot of ways, both, first of all, internally against ourselves. I think that is a reason, for example, that a lot of women suffer from autoimmunity.
Right.
It's that internalized rage. And I can talk about what's happening physiologically on a cellular level and actually why it's important to have master plants to help interrupt that. So I think that's one part of it. But I will say, before we get into the plant part of this, I also studied ancient astrology. I study ancient astrology and have for a long time. I think ancient mystics have looked at some of the very existential questions that we're very much struggling with right now and have come to, I don't want to say answers, because there aren't answers. I think it's more perspectives and strategies. So I practice ancient astrology, Hellenistic, Arabic, Persian astrology, and it's been so instructive for me as a physician, and a medical doctor to see how complex these systems were, how technical, how intellectually engaging, and how willing they are to look at the unknown and not need to come to an exact answer. But what they have done is created, and I'll use astrology as an example, but there's I Ching, there's numerology, there's a lot of different traditions, Kabbalah, many, many others that look at these kinds of questions. And the way astrology looks at it is as a language, saying these are energies that are running through all of us, and we are going to give it an archetype. And so anger, for example, would be like Mars, right? Represented by the Martian archetype. And how do we, and when I do readings for people, which I do sometimes, I'll talk about what's your karmic prescription? around this archetype, this Mars archetype, right? Because we need to engage them. And I know you are really big on training and strength and working out. And for me, I was not for most of my life. But when I started boxing, powerlifting, running, which was in my early 40s, and I have been very consistent for the past decade, I started to master my anger, which prior to that would explode out of me at very unexpected and unwelcome moments in not very healthy ways, I think, or not welcome by me. And I think, I could talk about why I could look at the energies of my particular blueprint and why it was such a struggle for me to express my own anger. Some people, their big challenge is to stop expressing, right? And to harness it differently, right? I'll give you a very short answer, even though I've already given kind of a long answer around that. How do you harness the anger? How do you metabolize it? I don't think we exactly metabolize it. It's more like, how do we make it work for us without letting it eat us up and destroy us? And that has to do with, right, the archetype of Mars, I'll just say, right? So this is just an ancient mystic kind of perspective, is strategy, energy. You can't do anything without Mars, right? Nothing's going to you're not going to accomplish things without that fire. So strategy, energy, motivation, ambition, right? All of that. On the other side, it can be conflict, confrontation, violence, things that really can eat you up, right? Warfare, combat. So finding the ways that you can channel those kinds of energies and that archetype without it getting into those destructive places, which drain us. I mean, I think that's what people don't realize is when we walk around, and you're talking about that backpack is heavy, right? I just noticed this yesterday, which is why I was talking about it, is like, I've been angry about various things, individual, personal things, collective things, I let myself kind of get hijacked by anger, in the last week. And then I realized I was totally exhausted. Not function, fatigue, exhaustion. And that was where I was like, I have to move through this, and I have to start figuring out where I can put my energy so that I can push all of that strategy, energy, need to utilize the Mars in me in a productive way that is meaningful and not depleting.
It's so funny that you mentioned like strength training, because that's where I feel like I channel it the most. Like when I'm having a rough day, the best thing that I can do for myself is have a grueling workout. And it's like I channel all of the rage, all of the anger, and whether or not I have a personal best or not it's like I put everything into my body, and it's therapeutic in a way because it gets me out of my head. Because, it sounds like we've been having a similar week actually, because I've been training actually a little harder this week, pushing myself a little harder. And in the last 3 days, the other thing that has been giving me a reprieve, I will say, from that charge, which can feel overwhelming, is actually getting in my garden. So I've been winterizing, I have, I live on the East Coast, so, we're moving and we're late, at the time of this recording, it's late fall, kind of moving into the winter time. So I'm like cutting back my hydrangeas back down to the shrubs. I'm like wrapping up my boxwoods in burlap. And I like talk to them and like my little lavender trees and like making, so I'm like preparing for spring, and I was, feeding them and doing all these little things and I spent, and I was raking the leaves, all the things. And I had my husband come out for the raking of the leaves bit in the beginning. And he's like, I hate this. I'm like, all right, that's fine. You can go back in. This is my time with my plants. Like, this is my time with my garden. Like, there was this like parasitic, it feels like a parasitic weed that was taking over, and it was like wrapping around my lavender bush, and it had berries on it. And it was just, I have to look, it was almost like a predatory plant. I'm like, okay. So I haven't been tending to my garden literally and figuratively. And there have been weeds that have sprouted up here without me even realizing it. And it was a huge mother. And I know we've talked before about, having reverence for all plants, and like, we sort of look at weeds and we call like chamomile, like we say it's like this derogatory, dandelion is this derogatory. So when I say this, I mean, it was a parasitic plant in my garden, kind of taking over, like wrapping around, and almost like a snake coiling around, like a boa constrictor, almost like coiling around and suffocating. So I was pulling it out. I'm like, how did I let this happen? So sometimes, it's sort of a parable, I guess, or a parallel, I should say, for maybe the mental clutter that I was feeling as well. But strength training always helps me channel my anger in a positive way. And then the other thing is I'm just outside, like just humming and like just like talking to my hydrangeas I love them so much. So I like talk to them, feed them, blah, blah, blah. So those are the two things that I love to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think, those are ways of tending ourselves, right? I mean, and we're obviously you're tending your garden, but in doing so, it's doing something, right? And I think just from an Indigenous healing perspective, there is definitely a longstanding idea that we can put very big and difficult energies that we are feeling into the earth, and the earth alchemizes them, transforms them, catalyzes them to something that's not destructive. So I think you're experiencing that. And we all most of us do experience that in our gardens, or in being outdoors, or in hiking, or, like, I'm ridiculous. My favorite winter activity, other people love going skiing and I don't know what else. I love shoveling. I like shoveling snow. Like I put on my music like really loud, and I just shovel, and I am like sweaty. I'm happy. I'm like, I feel strong. That's part of how I connect to my own body, which, by the way, I mean, I think that's a really important part of moving rage. And I want to say, it's not about not expressing ourselves and not, just go into your garden, right? And like, work out so that you don't cause problems.
Yes.
All about causing problems. Let's cause problems. Like, we need to. Mm-hmm. It's more about doing it in ways that are constructive and productive rather than destructive, which, as much as we think we need to be destructive sometimes, it's almost never effective, especially when you're coming up against empire. This big, powerful, long-standing entity that, right, coming with destructive energy is only very, 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 very rarely going to actually get us where we want to go. But we can come in constructive ways and utilize that kind of, Mars energy, right? Once we've worked out and been in the garden, the answer is not now just go be a nice little person doing your nice little life. It's like, okay, now I'm ready to kick shit up,
I love that reframe. That's such a good reframe, because I think I think I might even been unconsciously even alluding to that inappropriately in my comment to you. Like, how do we metabolize it? How do we get rid of it? You're not going to get rid of it. You're just going to move it through your body and use it in a way that is constructive rather than destructive. Yeah. Good. Well, I kind of want to go down a rabbit hole with like Arabic and Persian astrology, and maybe I'll just footnote that. Can we come back to that? Because I'm very interested in, we've been talking a little bit about Mars, which, let me think, Mardi, is that Tuesday? Is it Mars Day? Would that be Tuesday? I'm reading this in your book. It was like lundi, or Monday was Moon Day, which is lune en français. And then Mardi was Tuesday,
Yes.
which is that Mars Day?
Yes.
Okay. And then just walk through the week just because I thought it was so great. It was like, and then there was Odin. I forget what Wednesday was now.
Right. I need to I don't even have it in my head at this moment, but we know Friday, for example, is it's not just based in the Greek names, which are the ones that I know best, but it's also based in some of like Thor Day, right? It's
Thor,
Thursday.
yeah, Thursday. Yeah, yeah.
Right. So it's really interesting. I think it's Mercredi is like Mercury's day.
Right. That was Wednesday.
So it's you have to know a few different
and Saturn Day
and mythologies.
Saturn Day was, yeah.
Saturn's Day.
Yeah. Which is
right.
Saturday.
So
yeah.
Going through, I mean, it's funny that we don't realize it's not just an astrology. It's actually how our whole, all of the rituals, all of the months and days of the week, et cetera, are all couched very much in mythology, which we think is myth, right? Which is pretend, a story. But actually, what I discovered, particularly in researching my book, was that myth is we hear the part of myth that is for the uninitiated, and they sound like stories. But Indigenous people who have been for many centuries extra literate, I would call it, right? Not illiterate, which is how we refer to them, they're less than because they don't keep all of their information in books and read books and write. But instead, actually, they have this massive oral tradition. They're able to, through song, through dance, through myth, through sacramental objects that they use as memory holders, where they can literally talk about geography over thousands of kilometers, like if you're talking about Aboriginal Australians, by looking at a piece of a ritual instrument that they have. We'll look at it and be like, oh, look at that amulet, how beautiful. But for them, it is a memory map. And so they have these huge bodies of knowledge all embedded in myth that are for the initiated. And they think that is much more safe and valuable and beneficial, as opposed to having everything in a book that could just be destroyed and lost, and then nobody will.
Well, we have very ample evidence of many books being burned at various points in human history.
Well, and I think of that even right now, right? People are getting all these digital books. They're streaming movies or shows, and which are not always, but in some cases are truly works of art, right? Our ideas, our philosophies. And let's say streaming disappeared. Let's say certain books were banned. You don't even have to burn them, right? You just take them off of Kindle and they're no longer available to people, and that information is gone. So, there's something to be said for having these volumes in oral tradition and in story and in myth that you are initiated into starting when you're young and over the course of your life. And of course, myth is interesting because we learn things in Western or global North or whatever, or modern society, whatever we want to call it. Philosophy is over there, science is over there, mysticism is there, ethics are over there, legal, right? The way that these stories are told, they are all of those things. They embody all of that information in this beautiful tapestry. So it's not, the same way we say, oh, the brain's over there, the immune system's over there, the bones are over there. None of those have to do with each other. And then, of course, they do. Same with this is you can't really have all of these fields not talking to one another. And that's, again, what these oral traditions embody. So it's very beautiful. And, the days of the week and the way we don't even realize that, they're named after deities, right? They're named after myth. It's in our whole society. And we're no, we're so serious and, important and scientific and, no, we're just humans, same as all the other humans, and we want to kind of make ourselves exceptional, and we're not. We're no better, no worse. I mean, we might be worse, but we're definitely not better than any of the other humans that had their own ways of doing things before us, you know? And ancient mystics didn't think, oh, we're evolving, which is what we've been taught. They were like, yeah, we have dark ages, golden ages, dark ages, golden ages, dark ages, right? So we cycle. And I think that's probably a lot more true and accurate than this idea humans get better and better and better and better, you know? So that means we have a responsibility either way, right? To uphold the best within ourselves and around us, no matter whether, you know, one or the other is true.
I love that because when you're saying that, and this, again, you can feel free to redirect me, but it almost feels like, why don't we lean into that feminine energy a little bit where things are cyclical? Like even with trauma, you know, it's like, oh, I've dealt with that. I've been to CBT, been doing the thing and like, I don't need to deal with that. And then it's like, and then it comes up and you're like, oh, it's still there. And then we work on it a little bit more. And then it dives back down into the, you know, into the ethers, into the shadows, wherever. And then it sort of comes up again and up and up and up again. And I think if for me, I used to think, you know, when I was maybe a bit more uninitiated, you might say, that I was very mechanistic. It was like, if you can't explain it and there's no RCT, well, like lack of evidence, if you bring it without evidence, I can dismiss it without evidence. And it's like, well, you know, I think, and so that's, you know, have a lot of love and compassion for that girl who's just trying to find her way in this sort of very masculine, linear, we're just getting better and better and better. And here's the mechanism, and here's the enzyme, and here's the outcome, and here's the pathway, and here's this. I think science really is, if we want to talk about science, because we're having this sort of discussion around masculine and feminine, I think it's like a dance. We have no idea what we're doing. Here is the uncertainty. And over time, you know, it will reveal itself with time. And if we can just allow ourselves, maybe bring in a little bit of that feminine energy. And this is like gender agnostic, by the way. I'm not talking about chromosomal sex. I'm just talking about masculine, feminine energy. I know you get this, but just for the listener, it's like our relationship with the unknown. That's what science really should be. It's like, we actually have no idea. It's in the same way that if you think about, you know, you talk about this in the book a lot, which I really appreciated, where in North American West modern society, we have this very, I would say, tortured relationship with death. You know, we ship our elders off to old care, you know, palliative care, you know, I guess at the end, palliative care or nursing homes, rather than, you know, keeping them communally where I think they should be, because we don't want to see them aging. We don't want to see them die. You know, but if you were to think about death every single day, and there was a passage in your book, I don't exactly remember where, but I remember reading it a couple of times. I was like, oh, this is so good. It was something to the effect of, but if you think about death every single day, it's a reminder for you to live like they're pairs, you know, like they're sisters, they're brothers, you know, like they walk together. So the more that you can think about death, the more you're reminded to actually live the life that you have while you have it.
Right. Well, we are, right, as much as we want to talk about non-duality, I mean, we do, right? We don't know what joy is without grief. Like, right. We couldn't identify joy as being joy if we didn't have something else that was in contrast to that, right? And we do need, and, you know, I think it's interesting just when it comes to death, and then I'll talk about science for a second. You know, I find it always interesting. Death is the one thing that is absolutely certain for every single person in this world. There's not much else that is absolutely certain, but death is. And there's an argument, you know, in my trainings, I always have sections on death where we explore that, because a lot of people who look into this feel death is really life and life is death, right? We can't appreciate life without appreciating death on some level, even though it is unknowable. It's also, we have to be in relationship with that concept and the fact that it is inevitable. And it is part of what every death we encounter in our lives, right, prepares us for our own death, in a sense, right? We're learning. I mean, this whole process of life is really being on a journey to learn to appreciate where we are right now, who we are right now, and to live into ourselves as much as possible. And we're kept very busy, thinking we're supposed to be doing a lot of other things. And I don't know about you, but I definitely get sucked into that, and then I kind of melt down.
Of course I do. I'm like, oh, look at this to-do list that I'm going to do. And I'm going to be so much better once it's done. And, it's the same.
Right. Or it's like I have to achieve this or I have to get there. And it's like, that's actually not what being human is about at all. There are things it's about, but that is definitely not the main thing. And it's what we're told it's about. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a softening, to your point around the feminine energy that we all have within us, the masculine, which all of us have been imbued with and sort of taught to value the most, achieving, right? It's very Martian energy.
I was going to say it's Mars. It's Mars, yeah.
Right? But there is another kind of energy, which, again, archetypally would be moon energy or Venusian energy, which are two different kinds of energy, but they're more nourishing. They're more reflective, right? They're more expansive, and there's a not doing, a not knowing, a mystery, right? And that's what I love. I mean, I love science. I just want to say this is where kind of those two things meet, right? I love science. I think science is fascinating. And I think it's in chapter 8 in my book, kind of talk about science as being a language that describes mystery. But what science has become is an instrument that has been used to teach people they can't believe their own eyes, right? Like if a big giant, many $million study hasn't been done that shows the thing you saw is impossible, can't be true, hasn't been proven, right? We're going to discredit that, and of course, that's not what science is or should be. It is a dance. It is a process. It is a language and basically it's our desire to make the unknown more tolerable to us as human beings, right? Same as astrology, for ancient mystics, same as many other things. There are many that, we just want to understand the world a little bit better and feel a little less scared of what might happen next and a little more able to be present to what's here and what's available, And so I'm very fascinated by the process of science. I love asking the questions. I love exploring what happens without any expectation, right? Which is really what science is. It's like, I want to see what happens, which is not how a lot of science is conducted now. And it's certainly not how science is used.
Talk about external influence. This would be a perfect time to talk about. Yes. Yeah. Empires. Yeah. And, I think a little bit of science, I'm going to use the word God, but this can be the innate intelligence. It can be what I think a little bit of science distances you from God or that innate intelligence, that source, Allah, whatever word you want to use. But the more, even if you just think about the human form and all of its complexity, I think that there's no way that science can't bring you closer to awe and wonder and God, source, whatever, because I am constantly impressed. There's such reverence that I have, at least, my body of work is around the human body. And certainly there's lots of areas that I'm completely missing the mark on, but I feel like there's no way that science can't bring you closer to God when you see how beautifully intricate and how intelligent, like there's no way that someone, in a design lab was like, yeah, and then we'll do like the metabolic pathway. And then we'll do like there is source, there is an innate intelligence, there's a vitalism, some energetic something. And the words fail me at this moment. You can help me here, but there's no way that can't bring you closer to wonder and awe the more you learn about yourself.
I mean, I think, and this is something I go into in a lot of depth in my book, is some of the greatest scientists of all time were mystics. Pythagoras was a mystic. Einstein was a mystic. I mean, they weren't like, I'm a mystic, but they learned from their visions. They learned from trances. They were inspired in some cases by psychedelics and master plants. Many people may not know that Francis Crick of the Nobel Prize winning Watson and Crick discovers, quote unquote, of the structure, the double helix structure of DNA. He received that during an LSD trip. And, the person who invented PCR, which is actually another way of engaging and, understanding what's happening on a DNA level, also had an LSD trip where they were able to see molecules floating by and said that was a big part of how they invented PCR. Visions and epiphany have always been a big part of how science has evolved, which I think is really interesting. And scientists, the greatest scientists, have often been mystics. And even though I have some things to say about Descartes, not my favorite of all the scientists and philosophers out there, because of some of what resulted from his work and, including the witch hunts, the European witch hunts. But he too was visited by, an angel who showed him things about reductionism and the scientific method. I mean, I think, that's the important point, is that, again, science is a form of mysticism, except it's a very particular way of engaging with mystery. And I do think it is something that brings, for me, great wonder and awe. I mean, when I give presentations and keynotes, I talk about, how many billions of reactions are happening in cells every single minute. Every minute. You have no idea. You're just sitting here, thinking about like what you have to make for dinner. And each cell in your body is having billions of reactions all on its own every moment. All of the cells in our body, including billions of microbes, are each individual beings that have decided to come together in community to make you, right? They're all cooperating and collaborating, for the most part, we hope, together to be you, right? And I mean, there's just, all these beautiful ways that we're all part of this giant orchestra, from our tiniest parts like mitochondria all the way to what's happening, in the cosmos. And it is something that fills me with wonder and awe all the time. And I think that's really why I wrote that book in a certain way, was to show that, right? To show that like there is a real connection between science and mysticism and mystery and our bodies and these systems that we live in that are all very conscious, sentient beings working together. Even though we think they're things, they're all beings. And if we start to recognize that, maybe we will emerge from this existential loneliness that we all suffer from. And I think all humans suffer from. I don't think it's just us. I don't think it's just this time. I think it's always been true. And that's why we've always had ritual and ceremony and science and, all of these different languages, connecting to ancestors, connecting to nature, all things that help us contend with the human condition of existential loneliness that does come up.
I saw a meme once and I saved it. I'll send it to you. It's, if you ever think that you're lonely, just remember that you have, I can't remember the exact numbers, like 1.2 billion antibodies that, your immune system is willing to die for you at any moment, and I just remember, it's like a silly little meme, but it was like, oh yeah, there's a community within me that will fight to their death in order to protect me. And I thought that was such a comforting, in a way, it's such a comforting thought. And also, oh my God, there's an army of cells that would die, literally kill themselves for me at any moment if there's any invading pathogen, virus, bacteria, whatever. So I don't know if that solves that existential loneliness, but it's a comforting thought to think that there are communities of cells, and it's not just cells, but it's tissues, organs, glands, systems that will work and collaborate together and corroborate together to protect you and keep you healthy.
Well, I think, one of the things that I found really interesting, right? We have there's been a whole epidemic of loneliness, that's been announced in the United States. And I'm sure it's not unique to the United States by our Surgeon General, like we are going to fight this epidemic.
You mean isolating people from each other for 3 years was bad for us, Maya? Is that what you're saying?
But it was before that, actually, even. So in the polls that were done, it did not start. I'm sure, obviously, we know well that caused many, many, many more problems. But it was something that existed even before that. And, one of the things that I looked at in the science is when people feel depressed, their neurons prune synaptic connections to other neurons. So when you are depressed and isolated, your neurons become lonely. They become less connected. Your mitochondria, when you're in cell danger, right? When your cell perceives that it's in a danger state, which can be for physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual reasons, because your mitochondria will translate that to something physical, whatever the perceived danger is. Your mitochondria go from being branched spaghetti to meatball structures where they are not connected, where they are not exchanging information, where they are not releasing waste appropriately, where they are not sharing nutrients. So when you feel isolated, lonely, in danger, you have lonely mitochondria, you have lonely neurons. And what I found very interesting as I was looking at what master plants do, what psychedelic master plants can do, is they actually help neurons to reconnect, make new synaptic connections with other neurons. They help, if done well with the right support, and this does not have to be big doses, but can be microdoses or quantum doses, they actually help reverse that cell danger response so that mitochondria go from being meatballs back to the branched spaghetti and start being in community, like on every level, from a mitochondrial level to a cellular level to a systems level to the world around us. We want to be in connection. We want to be connected. We want to be in that conversation all the time. And we are. We don't even exist without being in constant conversation, even from a microbiome standpoint, right? When I go see a person, if I'm in a room with people, if I'm in a building with people, I am exchanging microbes, and I will never be the same person again after I leave that situation, because the microbes in my body are determining what I like to eat, how I sleep, what I think about, my mood, who I'm attracted to, right? All of that is happening based on my microbial makeup, which is shifting and changing all the time, depending on if I'm in nature, depending on who I'm around, if I have pets, if I keep chickens, right? All of these different things are influencing me and who I am every moment. I'm just a conversation between cells and microbes. And I don't mean this in we're just a bunch of, meaningless cells. I mean, we're this gorgeous music. We're this gorgeous conversation that's just always changing. And I think that's pretty incredible and fills me with wonder and awe when I think about it.
Let's tuck into a little bit of the science of psychedelics and using master plants, because I think that psychedelics, there is is a rebirth? I don't know what the right word is, but there's a lot of interest in it now. There was, in the book you talk about the history of psychedelics, how, it sort of was being used, and then there was the war on drugs, and many psychedelics were classified as Schedule 1, having absolutely no medical benefit. Many of them still remain on that list. What is a different, and just by way of definition, and then we can kind of get into the science, what is the difference between a master plant and a psychedelic?
So a master plant is really, it's an indigenous term. And here I am not speaking for indigenous people, but just, taking very universal and shared concepts that describe these very powerful plants that are considered masters, right? Hence master plants that change human consciousness and human behavior. So not all master plants are psychedelic. Coffee would be a master plant. Cacao is a master plant. Tobacco is a master plant. These are powerful plants that transmit this ancient knowledge, but are not necessarily psychedelic. And then ayahuasca would be a master plant. San Pedro cactus, peyote, mushrooms, right? So they can be flora, fauna, or fungi. They're not like botanically, always plants, but they're considered to be teachers. They're considered to be transmitters of ancient knowledge, and they are called often grandmother, grandfather, family members, literally. And what I think is really interesting, so all psychedelics are masters. Not all master plants are psychedelic, but the key is you come with respect, you come with reverence, you come with humility to these teachers, and with gratitude for any gifts that they give you. And when I've talked to any of my teachers about these master plants, they will never say, and this is contrary to, I think, the psychedelics movement right now that is wanting, and I understand why, to frame all psychedelics as being good for us. They will never say master plants are good or bad. They'll say they're powerful. And how you engage with power, with that power, will determine the kind of outcome you may have. And when I say outcome, I don't mean you're going for a journey and, what happens in that journey, although it could be, but more like how humanity, how our society might experience the influence of these masters, right? Do we know how to come with reverence? Do we know how to come with humility? Are we coming with gratitude, or are we coming to commoditize and abuse and, control, right? And so that is, I think, a really interesting conversation for us to have around us, the greater collective, around what these master plants, what role they can play, and how we can help this process offer the kind of healing that it has the real capacity to do, and not run into the kinds of problems we had in the 50s and 60s that ended up getting them made illegal.
I think there can be a misinterpretation of how they work as well. So I think that there can be also very much, when we look at the allopathic model of medicine, it's like you take this, here's a pill for every ill. So here is a pill, you're going to take it, and your cholesterol levels are going to be quote unquote normal. Here's a pill, you're going to take it, and you're going to lose weight, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that we can conflate that sort of pill for every ill kind of mechanistic, really, view of treating sickness. And we can potentially have a conversation about how we're usually spiritually sick before we're actually physically sick. However, my point here is that it can be very easy to look at a psychedelic and say, I'm going to take it and then I'm going to be better. Or I can just keep going back to it and I'm going to feel really great while I'm on it, or what have you. And the, what you were saying, the reverence and the respect and the intention around the gifts that the plants might, gift you with, are lost in that, well, this is going to fix my X, Y, and Z. Can you comment a little bit? Is that something that you have observed? Is that, what is your take on that?
Well, I'm going to answer you with a little lore first.
As every good shaman should.
Well, Well, so when I wrote about each of the master plants, which I wanted to really get to know them each very, very well, I looked at lore and myth around them, as well as science and history, because I think that is a way that we get to know them really, really well. And tobacco is really the, I think, most widely held sacred plant in the world, even in places where tobacco is not indigenous to that area. It's been spread in this way, and every single culture that I have found honors tobacco as the most sacred and protective plant. And the lore around tobacco is tobacco created humans to honor tobacco. So if we take that idea, and we think about how we have engaged with tobacco.
Gosh, well, it's like
bowls
sorry,
you
tobacco.
over.
Sorry, tobacco. Let's redo. Can we get a redo?
Well, right. So I don't know if that answers the question here, but I think there's a lot of, so number one, how we come to these plants and to these experiences is 99% of the medicine. What these plants can do, and they can do it in big doses, which is what we tend to believe in the most in our society, but I've seen them do it in quantum doses.
What is a quantum dose?
So that's a vibrational dose. Yeah, okay. It's a vibrational dose. And I can talk about different ways to engage with that. But for example, the cover of my book is a slice, and I'll show it, not to, it's a slice of ayahuasca. That is a quantum dose of ayahuasca, right? You see this sacred geometry, and you experience some of the medicine of that plant. That is, I in a sense, quantum dose, because I grow master plants. I grow Brugmansia. I grow an ayahuasca vine that's over a decade old. I grow San Pedro cactus. I grow tobacco. I grow many, many master plants, and that is part of my service to those plants. I don't consume my plants. I tend them, and I experience wisdom and transmissions and ass kicking from these plants. So
give me an example. Can you expand on that? So you have this ayahuasca vine that you've tended to for 10 years. Certainly one might say have you had quantum dosing from that? Is that just being in its presence? Is that a way to experience quantum dosing from the plant?
Well, right. So I'll tell you.
Am I messing it up with all my Westernism here?
You're not. No, I mean, right. It's there's so many ways we could kind of unpack this. And one of the ways I'll say is, I can tell a lot of stories about the way the plants kind of teach me and transmit to me. So one of them is when I first got this ayahuasca vine, I was away. I was leaving right after this plant arrived, and I put her in a sunroom. I came back with my teacher, one of my Indigenous teachers, after being away for a couple of days, and she was dying, the plant. And looked like she had an infestation. She must have come with some infestation. And anyway, my teacher's like, oh, we have to save her. She's dying. We were washing her leaves, put a red ribbon on her pot, all these things. And we kind of revived her. She looked better. And I said, and she said later, my teacher stops me and she says, Maya, if you don't give the ayahuasca vine attention, she'll do things to call your attention. And I was like, listen, I know you like to talk this way, but I'm going to need you to be explicit because that sounds really ominous. She's like, no, nothing. She just, if she wants your attention, she's going to do things to call it. And I'm like, all right. So I tell my husband at the time, I tell him the story, and he's like, well, I don't like the sound of that. He's like, can we get a divorce from this plant? And I was like, no, I've been waiting for this plant for a long time. I am very excited to like take good care of this plant. I was like, absolutely not. You know, within 2 years, he and I were no longer together. I still have the plant. You know, and I don't laugh about that lightly. I mean, obviously, it was an excruciating experience, as these life, you know, initiatory experiences can be, but these plants influence your life. It is about the relationship. And I noticed it when I started doing microdosing coaching with people. People would reach out to me and have questions around how to microdose, or that they wanted to microdose, they wanted to be educated. We'd have our session. Before they would ever ingest anything, their lives would start to transform the way you would think it would transform after you had ingested, you know, and had a whole big experience. No, the relationship began from the moment they felt the pull. And so I began to understand that there is this way that the relationship is that quantum, right? It's happening in the quantum. And this has an indigenous precedent, really, because anyone who's been in an ayahuasca ceremony has listened to Icaros, which are these songs sung by ayahuasqueros, the shamans. And they are not songs made up by the shamans. They are these ayahuasqueros diet, it's called, with the ayahuasca plant, sometimes for months before they can actually start to serve the medicine and do these ceremonies. And during that time, they are given these transmissions, vibrational transmissions from the ayahuasca that is in the form of sound that they can then sing. And it is considered to be medicine of the plant as potent as ingesting. And sometimes I've had ceremony with ayahuasqueros that don't serve ayahuasca to drink. They just drink a little themselves and then sing their Icaros. And people are having ceremonial experiences, having visions, everything, because they're experiencing the medicine of the plant. So this is what I mean by quantum dosing. It's a new agey word that has a very real scientific definition. And I do unpack it more in my book, but, you know, ultimately, I was tending my plants at one point, and I got this very strong message that was, why do people think they need to ingest us in order to experience our medicine? Show them another way. This was many years ago, and I'm thinking, you know, I know about homeopathy, I know about flower essences, but what am I really being asked to do here? And I kind of noodled with it, struggled with it. I was like, I'm a neurologist. What do they expect me to do, you know, et cetera. And ultimately created these tonics with my plants that were made in ceremony together with an altar at certain times of month, at certain times of year. Sometimes the plants let me know exactly when, where we created these drops that are made with my medicine songs, the music of the plants, the ceremony, and we call them ceremony in a bottle, and they are actually quantum doses of these master plants that I grow. And I had no idea if they would be impactful in any way, because, I mean, it's vibrational. And, you know, as much as
your mechanistic brain is like, how is this going to work?
Yeah, you know, and also, you know, like, I'm not interested in doing something that's not, you know, that's
not impactful
type thing, right? Yeah. I'm like, I mean, if I'm spending time on something, I want it to be real. I want it to really help people. And so I started kind of beta testing them at like retreats that I was doing, you know, with consent, of course. And of course, they don't make people trip or anything like that. You know, they're legal, they're safe, all of that, which is valuable, because some people who are sober, who are children, who are pregnant, you know, who are medically fragile or have fragile mental health, or who are just sensitive. I am one of those people. I feel things that other people may not notice or feel. So, you know, a big dose of psychedelics, and I have been in ceremonies and had those kinds of experiences. I mean, they are, you know, being blasted open with a cannon for me. You know, some people don't experience it that way. I do. people were having transformations, big transformations. And they didn't even know. I mean, I had people who, I did this retreat with one of the drops, and we did a follow-up call together after. People were not in touch with each other. Everyone had gone home and emptied out their closets because they said, I don't feel like anything in my closet really belongs to me anymore. And each person said it in their own way. One person was like, I was repulsed by my clothes. It didn't feel like me. Somebody else was like, I really need to declutter my closet. My husband's going to be away this weekend. I'm so excited, right? Everybody said it in a different way. I'm like, okay, weird. Next time we get on, again, nobody's talking to anybody else. We're doing this integration call. Everybody's changed their hair. There's a doctor, she shaved the side of her head. So she could flip it over, no one would see it, but she was like, someone else had dyed her hair like burgundy. I mean, again, everybody had these shifts. Then, one of the people actually reached out, said, my husband wants to thank you. Our sex life has gone through the roof since we had that ceremony, right? All of these different things that were unfolding. And I mean, I could tell you so many amazing stories of synchronicities, of these incredible things that you would never believe could be possible. I mean, one of the stories is literally about a Maserati. somebody literally talked about getting a Maserati and then walked into a store basically, and the person there sold Maseratis and was like, I actually have this this Maserati for lease that I can give you for anyway, and she never thought she could afford it, et cetera, et cetera. Long story short, she walked out with a Maserati. Wow. I mean, these wild stories. I mean, not try quantum drops, you'll get a Maserati, but it's more like yes, becoming open. Yeah, disclaimer. But it's more like understanding that, and this is the neuroscience of psychedelics in general, reality is really what we think we're going to see, confirmed by us again and again. So when we have this constellation of parts of our brain that work together called the default mode network. They work together as a network, and they're very good at suppressing our emotions, our traumas, our childhood memories, et cetera, so that we can be functioning people in our society. And one of the things it does is something called predictive coding. Predictive coding is a great survival mechanism, and it's good. I'm not knocking it. But basically, even though we think we go into a new situation and we're seeing all the details of that situation, it turns out, actually, we go into new situations and we think we're seeing all these details, but we probably pick out just a few. Our brain picks out just a few details of a new situation and fills everything else in from past experience. Again, great for survival because you don't have time if you're walking into a very dangerous situation, like a car barreling towards you. You can't be like, I wonder what's happening. Let me see every single detail. But at the same time, if you've had a car barreling towards you and then you walk into every situation feeling like something triggers this car barreling towards you, and that's how you react to, having a
startling noise, let's say, or
yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. Exactly. Right. Or a difficult conversation with your boss or something, right? You don't want to come in and this deer in the headlights or fight or flight or whatever kind of thing. You want to be able to come in and realize, okay, this is what's happening here. I can show up for this. And so what psychedelic master plants do is actually interrupt this predictive coding, where we start to actually have temporarily all of these the programming, right? And sort of cellular memory become much more clear to us while we're in some way engaged with that, so that we can see a reality that is not colored only by our past experience. We can see something new, something different. It interrupts our patterns. And what I think is really interesting is that a lot of times we're surrounded by opportunity. We're surrounded by a lot of potential friends, potential better situations for us, et cetera, but we don't have the eyes to see it. We don't have the ears to hear it because we are limited by our programming, by our past experience, by our predictive coding. So what can happen, whether on a macro dose level, whether on a micro dose level, or whether on a quantum dosing level, is we can open these gates of perception and see what is available to us that we couldn't normally see. And that is where I think quantum dosing shines in these kinds of interrupting this stuckness that we have based on past experiences and old stories.
And it's gentle. And that's one of the, I wanted to contrast between macrodosing, this sort of maybe what you might experience in a ceremony. You might experience, well, I guess MAPS is MDMA research. So it's not technically plants. It's a man-made chemical. They're looking at MDMA with, treatment-resistant depression and veterans and so forth. But one of the things, I can say from my limited experience with psychedelics is that the macro doses, you said you're a sensitive person and it feels like you're being like, it's like a rocket. It's too much for me. I also feel like it's a bit, I don't want to say it's aggressive, but it's too aggressive for me. I need to be serenaded. I need to be caressed. I need it to be a little gentler. And I have found, at least with psilocybin, like with certain mushrooms, I really love a microdose because the change is gentle and it's spread out over a longer delta, we'll say. I don't take it every day. It's sort of like one day off, maybe 2 or 3 days off, one day on, 2 or 3 days off, and then on again. But it's just a gentle unfurling. I don't know if it's just how it feels for me, that like the truth is being revealed to me in a way that I can process. When it's those sort of micro doses, or even like what's sort of called like a museum dose, like sometimes that even feels like a little bit much for me. So in sharing that, I wanted you to maybe, expand a little bit on microdosing, because in the scientific community, again, what is being studied is more of that macro dose and how we can look at, and we'll get to the the tryptamines and all of that in a moment, how it can sort of rewire activity in some of these limbic system, like the hyperactivation in some of these limbic system areas. But talk a little bit about why microdosing might also be an option, because there is this sort of feeling like, well, microdosing is not really studied. It's not really a real thing, in the same way that quantum dosing also can be, I would expect, almost dismissed in the same sort of brush, like broad brush. Well, there's no RCT for that, so we're not going to look at it.
Well, right. So I think it's important, first of all, to understand that Indigenous people have science that they've operated with for millennia. We have actually built a lot of our pharmaceutical system off of Indigenous knowledge. There were bioprospectors that have gone. Probably it's thought maybe as many as 80% of drugs, of pharmaceuticals that we use, including in the OR, including for pain, et cetera, all came from Indigenous knowledge. And Indigenous people, if you ask them where they learned complex science, and when I say complex science, I can use the example of the ayahuasca brew. Most people think, oh, it's the ayahuasca vine. They make this, drink of it. It's, trial.
Cut it, boil it, and then, yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, the ayahuasca brew is actually incredibly complex, because ayahuasca, by itself, the vine, is not a psychedelic at all. It is actually plants that contain DMT that have the psychedelic effect, but our guts break down DMT very, very quickly. We ourselves endogenously make our own DMT. Obviously do not generally, although I do say I live in a very psychedelic reality all the time. I do think I probably have very active DMT, but we don't sit and trip all the time, even though we have DMT in our bodies. And that's because our guts break it down. And so the only way that you actually can have the kinds of experiences, large experiences that most people would associate with the ayahuasca brew, is by combining, in a very specific way, a plant that has DMT and the ayahuasca vine. The ayahuasca vine has to be cut, boiled down until it's incredibly thick, like syrup, and added to then a plant that has DMT and very specifically prepared, because the ayahuasca has actually in it a compound that blocks the enzyme that breaks down DMT in our guts. Now,
so that it can survive digestion. So when you're
that the
drinking it,
DMT
the brew,
can survive
yeah.
digestion and then go and have these impacts on our physical system, on our nervous system. They did not have PCRs. They did not have, right? Like there were no ways that they could have molecularly, in their laboratories figured this out, but also to imagine that it could have been trial and error. And I can give you so many other examples of ways that Indigenous people have come to these ways of working with plants, like had to be injected right under the skin in order to be effective, right? Like things that just wouldn't just happen with a jungle that has over 200,000 unique plants that, I don't know if you've been to the jungle. I have been to the Amazonian rainforest. It is not possible to imagine how you could find any one plant. I mean, the ayahuasca vine is big and, but it's not like, oh my God, I would pick that out of all the many other 100,000 plants in the jungle, right? The Indigenous people say the plants told us. The plants showed us how to get the medicine of these plants. So I find it very interesting, when we think as Westerners, as the global North, as this scientific modern way of looking at it, which I've been trained in and I have a lot of respect for. On the one hand, when we try to impose, there's only one way these plants could possibly be effective, more is more, less is less, when Indigenous people clearly have shown us and have said many, many times, there are many ways to engage with these plants. And actually, in many cases, I learned about the shamanic dose, yes, that big dose, the aphrodisiac dose, which is kind of between a microdose and a macrodose, and then the medicinal dose, right? And then these quantum doses for them, it's not even like, I have to say this is a quantum dose, just a dose, So that's just sort of to intro into this idea of microdosing, which is a very long tradition in Indigenous medicine. And, so it's sub-psychedelic and is definitely more gentle, unfolds over time. And the reason it's not been studied well, besides belief systems, is because, and it is being studied more now, when I talk to the people at Johns Hopkins, because I've interviewed many, many different scientists who have been, doing a lot of the seminal research, they basically said, look, a big dose is something we can control. People come in, they get prepared, then they come in and they take the dose. We watch them, we sit with them for 5 hours, whatever number of hours, make sure they're okay, send them home, then we do follow-up. The IRB, the hospital, et cetera, can get behind that for a study. Microdosing doesn't really alter you in this way where you can't function in your life. You can go to work, you can parent, you can go shopping, you can do your life. People aren't going to come to take their microdose, sit for X number of hours, how many hours, waiting, being watched, you know what I mean? And they're not going to give people kind of what are still considered illicit substances either to take outside of the hospital. So it's complicated to study them because of these reasons. But we are seeing with microdosing that there are studies looking at asthma, looking at autoimmunity, looking at chronic pain, looking at depression. And a lot of the studies that have been published are more self-reporting, right? Where they'll look at a lot of different people who are self-reporting, but it looks like it's effective for addiction. People find that they rely less on other substances. If they're periodically microdosing, they are more likely to eat well, exercise, sleep well, feel more social, right? All of the things that we think should be, outcomes of maybe a big psychedelic experience or two can happen with microdosing and maybe more, right? Because maybe having these periodic doses in lower doses, sometimes receptors respond more effectively to lower doses.
It's like a hormesis. It's like a hormetic
Exactly.
stress. Yeah. Yeah.
I think microdosing, honestly, will be where psychedelics will shine the most in mainstream medicine. I don't actually think that these big doses are necessary or are right for every single person. Again, this is not what kind of is popularly being touted right now, but that is my position. I think there are some people for whom a large dose is life-changing and could not be more important. Life-saving, I would say. So I am 100% behind having that be available to people with the right support before, during, and after. And I really have to very strongly emphasize that, because no study that has showed success has been without that part. And so I think it is an important component. But I do think microdosing is something that will be beneficial for more people, more conditions, has fewer side effects. And what I mean by that is what happens when we are ingesting a large dose of psychedelics, or a small dose, but certainly a large dose, is we're opening these critical periods of plasticity that were only last ever open during childhood. So during childhood, we have these window periods of plasticity where we have to learn how to walk, talk, feed ourselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, do all these things in a very short period of time. And we have this incredible ability to do that because of these window periods of plasticity that then close when we're still very young. We used to be told we never have plasticity again, after whatever, 15, 18, that's it. But now we know we have plasticity throughout our lives. Exercise helps that, fasting helps, many things. But to open these window periods of plasticity, we have to be really careful, because anything can happen, right? Good or bad. You can be re-traumatized in the same way, right? Like when we are traumatized in childhood, why childhood trauma is so imprinted upon us is because of those window periods of plasticity. It's why later in life, we're less likely to have that imprint of trauma. It happens, but it doesn't happen as often or as easily. What we're doing when we open these window periods again is it's risky, right? It could be something that heals us, right? If we have the right container, if we have the right ceremonial container and the preparation and the nurturing and the support and the integration afterwards, we can realize, oh my God, I'm not, I'm worthy of love, or I wasn't that bad little person I thought, whatever it is. Or we can actually be re-traumatized. And I've had many people come to me when I've given keynotes or talks or et cetera, have said, I have had the worst experience of my life. Right? And this is reflected in the scientific literature. People say it can be the most meaningful experience of their life. And that's if it's good or bad, right? Good or difficult can be the most meaningful experience, and can also be the worst experience of their life if it's really a terrible experience and they don't find the meaning in it. And it doesn't necessarily mean they haven't put the effort in. It's just you're opening this window, and there's risk to that. And so I think microdosing has a lot of potential because it doesn't have that, black and white sort of like, and it's not as dramatic. And some people really do better, especially if they have dysregulated nervous systems. Microdosing can feel a lot gentler and more therapeutic.
I also wonder too about women, when we have these complex, we've been mentioning some of these complex diseases that seem to affect women more often than, or at least at a higher frequency than our male counterparts, things like autoimmune disease and dementia and Alzheimer's, and even just chronic pain and chronic fatigue. These are things that typically run in higher percentages in the female population than in the male. And even with, if I just think of my Hashimoto's women that I've cared for, like you can't even push them hard in the gym, like their recovery is different. They can't go for a grueling session of squat after squat after squat after deadlift after like you're going to wreck them. So in the same way that the stimulant, like, you know, for those women they tend to be, I don't use the word delicate, but I'll say that their immune system is more vulnerable to being overwhelmed. And so I like the idea of a microdose for women in general, because it can just naturally, gently over time unfurl. And that's not to say, as you said, it's not to say that these larger doses are not, there's no place for them. Of course there are, as you said, they're life-saving and they can be incredibly therapeutic for so many. But I think I do tend to agree with you in that, particularly for women, and that's just my bias and I could be wrong, but I do think that the microdosing for women in particular, because when I've done psychedelics, and granted they have been man-made, so they haven't been, I haven't done ayahuasca to date. It's been more in the MDMA realm. I have needed several days to recover from that. And it felt like my heart was just going to come out of my chest because it was so, and I have a very strong heart. So no, you know, there's no pre-existing conditions for me or contraindications for me not to engage in that, but it was just very, I found it personally very, very difficult. So I feel, and I've sort of had a relationship, we'll say, with mushrooms since then. And I just feel like it's a nice, gentle relationship and they love me. Sometimes they show me things that I'm, you know, maybe not ready to see, but it's, you know, whatever it is, like it's whatever the experience is supposed to be, or whatever's supposed to come up does come up and come out. Yeah. So that's just my take on that. Yeah.
I will say, as you know, I've been in the early stages of perimenopause before I even, you know, had any idea that that's what I was experiencing, because I thought, oh, perimenopause, I'll have irregular periods and hot flashes. No.
Yep.
It was like, you know, you have all these other things going on that you don't realize if you're not. And I'm a doctor, and I'm a pretty well-rounded doctor. So it was an interesting discovery for me how ignorant we all are, unless we've expressly learned about it. But that said, I would say microdosing and quantum dosing have been fundamental to the process of perimenopause for me. And I really cannot recommend that approach, that support highly enough for what is a very initiatory experience. You know, it's called a second adolescence. And like, I'm not even that far into it, and it's already been very cataclysmic in certain ways for me, just because everything's happening physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, and everything does. But experiences like this are very initiatory in that way.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think, you know, I wouldn't say, oh, you should go have a big ayahuasca journey because of perimenopause, necessarily, maybe for some people, but I would more say, could something gently support you and help you see what needs to change in your life? What might be your next step, your next phase, you know, this next version of you? I absolutely think that master plants can have a role there. And I do think, especially because our society does terribly for women as they get older, even though I think we are incredibly awesome, so much more awesome that I would never go back, never go back myself to any years before the year I'm in, you know. I think there's a real need for this kind of transmission of ancient wisdom to help women kind of accept the mantle of what we're walking into as we are at the very early stages of elderhood. I mean, I don't think perimenopause is about entering elderhood, but it is certainly the beginning, right?
Portal, yeah.
Beginning.
Mm-hmm. I think we need to figure out how to start making perimenopausal parties a thing. You know, like when you're pregnant, you have a baby shower, and obviously that's a momentous, life-changing again, as neuroscience, we know that there's like changes that happen in the brain when you're pregnant. There's changes that happen when you're menstruating, changes cyclically and, when you first initiate and start bleeding. And I think that as there's all these sort of parties and celebratory moments in a woman's life around her fertility. And I think that the moving away from fertility also should be a poignant, it should be just as celebratory. Like, I think that there needs to be like menopause and perimenopause parties. So if there's someone listening with an entrepreneurial bend, this would be a great business. I think that this would be an awesome thing to start, because it's, in the same way that there was, not that I would recommend this, but, there was, divorce parties. I think that there at the time was like, finally like gave them the right finger, kind of thing. Not that, not to make light of the situation, as you were saying, right? Like it is very traumatic. It's many times there's family reconstruction and all of that. But I think that there should be some aspect to, let's celebrate our elders and what can we learn from them, and what's the wisdom that a woman in her 40s, 50s, 60s, what is her lived experience? I remember sitting with my grandmother and I was like, God, I got to get all of my Lebanese recipes from this woman. Like I still have them, like when I spent like 4 days with her, just like, okay, and what about this one? And what about this one? And how do you do your Lebanese? And what's the difference between this and that? All the different, sort of steps that I could, extract from her. Yeah.
No, it's, I think there's a reason, right? As we talked about earlier, and I guess this is a little full circle, right? Our stories and our programming and how disempowering those can be in our lives. It's like, okay, women as they get older are actually very powerful and have the wisdom of experience, and also are not distracted in the same ways by what fertility just, does to distract us. Sure. Not saying it's distraction, but it's
but
different.
You have maybe you have offspring that you have to tend to. Maybe your cycle isn't as regular as you'd like it, or maybe it's causing, alterations in your mood. Maybe it's very painful. Like, there's so many different permutations of changes in your fertility cycle. And if you do become pregnant, there's the chemical and emotional and spiritual changes of pregnancy. And then there's the delivery. And then there's this thing called motherhood. All of those things can... All of it. Yeah. Distraction I think that's a neutral word, because I think that we are very much concerned with the viability of raising our children. And that's what we're designed.
Programmed.
Yeah,
we are programmed by our biology, by our psychology, by everything, by the cycles of life and, whatever. That's okay. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying, when the focus shifts, there's something else that can come forth, and it's an exciting opportunity if we allow it to be. And that's where I love and have definitely started talking much more openly about perimenopause, about that initiatory process. And, someone was talking about like croning ceremonies, right? Like not necessarily beginning now at this early perimenopause, but ultimately, after menopause and like kind of, we talk about the second Saturn return, right? Like your late 50s, they would do these ceremonies. And I just think there's a lot of unmined possibility. And as we're talking about this world that we have to imagine and co-create, that is made of ideas that we've never thought before, has to be a world we've never lived in before, because we can't just go back to some ism that we've already tried and it sucked. You know what I mean? Like, we need to start thinking differently. I do think that the wisdom of elders, and especially this kind of turning the focus and the power of, the
matriarch.
There's something there for us.
Where can people find you and your quantum doses and all the things that you are doing? If people want to find out more about you and your work, and your book, all the things, where can we find you?
The best place to go is my website, which is drmaya.com. And Quantum Drops are there. My book is there. I have a training program for psychedelic professionals that is open, and all of my other material, deprogramming, is all there on my website. People can also follow me on Instagram. I'm most active right now in my stories. I have a love-hate relationship with social media, but I'm there. I'm there and I'm active.
And if you want, if there was a woman, namely me, who wanted to get a tobacco plant to tend to in her home, maybe I'll talk to you about that offline. Maybe I'll talk to you about that. How I can get that in my home. Because I love to tend to my plants, like in my garden. I grow things in my home all year round. My son follows this one YouTube channel. I think I'll put it in the show notes. I think it's Creativity Explained or Creative Explained.
Oh, it's good. It's a good one.
And he shows how you can take seeds. So we are growing mango trees, we're growing blueberry, we're growing lemon, we're growing anything that has a seed that comes into the house that this guy has done a video on. We have them all over the house. We're trying to grow right now. I'm almost ready to plant my avocado seeds. So anyway, I would love to grow a few more plants in my home and see how that sort of transforms my aura, my space, my thinking, so I'll talk to you about that offline. But this has been such a treat, such a delight to speak to you. Thank you for going with the flow. I know we sort of started off with a topic that maybe, on the surface, not related to master plants, but I think as people, if they've gotten this far, they understand that it's all related. It's like us. It's what you said, us versus we. There's no such thing. It's just all of us together. We're all, and my husband talks about this idea of we're all just like God's fingers. Like we're all part of the hand. We're just like, it seems like we're individual, but, we're really all just sort of connected into one big system, one big cosmic system. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.